Imagine a land that has stood at the center of the world for over 2,500 years. Not at the edge of history, at the very heart of it. Every major empire that ever dreamed of ruling the known world eventually turned its gaze toward this plateau, this ancient crossroads between East and West. And every time it did, the result was catastrophic. The wars fought on Persian and Iranian soil were not skirmishes. They were world-altering collisions between civilizations, between religions, between entire ways of understanding human existence. They produced some of the highest casualty figures in the ancient and medieval worlds. They drew borders that still exist today. They ignited religious movements that shaped over 1 billion lives, and in some cases they ended empires so completely that the people who survived barely recognized the world they had inherited. What makes a war truly change the world? Is it the number of dead, the territory exchanged, or is it the invisible shift? The moment when one set of ideas replaces another, when one language silences the previous one, when a civilization looks in the mirror and no longer recognizes itself. How did a single battle in the mountains of Greece set in motion a chain of events that would eventually destroy the very empire that won it? How did a religion born in the deserts of Arabia unravel a Persian empire that had survived for over 4 centuries? And how did the Mongol devastation of Iran in the 13th century leave wounds so deep that some historians argue the region never fully recovered? These are not small questions, and they deserve real answers. If you are watching this channel for the first time, welcome. We make history feel like what it actually was: urgent, human, and consequential. Hit subscribe and leave a like if this kind of storytelling is what you came for. It genuinely helps us keep making these videos. Now, let us go back to the beginning. To understand the wars that broke Persia and Iran, you first need to understand what Persia was. The Persian Empire, known to its own people as the Achaemenid Empire, was not simply a large kingdom. When Cyrus the Great unified the Iranian plateau in the 6th century BCE, he created something genuinely new in human history: a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire governed not by the annihilation of conquered peoples, but by a policy of remarkable tolerance. Cyrus allowed deported populations to return to their homelands. He permitted local customs and religions to continue. He called himself King of Kings, not because he was arrogant, but because he ruled over many kings, many peoples, many traditions. At its height, the Achaemenid Empire stretched from the Aegean coast of modern Turkey to the Indus River in modern Pakistan. It encompassed Egypt, Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. Estimates suggest it governed somewhere between 30 and 50 million people, roughly 40% of the entire world's population at that time. That is not a figure historians all agree on, but even the conservative estimates are staggering. This was the empire that entered its first catastrophic war. And the enemy it underestimated would eventually become its destroyer. The Greco-Persian Wars lasted from approximately 499 to 449 BCE, spanning half a century of intermittent but devastating conflict. The popular myth, the one told in films and simplified textbooks, is that Greece heroically defended freedom against Persian tyranny. The reality is considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. The wars began not with Persian aggression against mainland Greece, but with a revolt. The Greek cities along the western coast of Anatolia, known as Ionia, had been under Persian rule for decades. In 499 BCE, they rose in rebellion, and they received military support from Athens and the city of Eretria. The Persian king Darius I crushed the revolt, burned the city of Miletus, and then faced a decision: let the Athenian interference go unanswered, or make an example. He chose to make an example. The first Persian invasion of mainland Greece in 490 BCE ended at the Battle of Marathon, one of the most famous upsets in military history. A Persian force, estimated by ancient sources at anywhere from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of soldiers, though modern historians tend toward the lower end, perhaps 20 to 30,000, was defeated by a smaller Athenian army on a coastal plain north of Athens. The Persian commanders had expected a quick victory. They did not get one. The second invasion, launched by Darius's son Xerxes in 480 BCE, was on a scale that dwarfed the first. Ancient sources like Herodotus claim figures of over 2 million soldiers, numbers so enormous that modern historians treat them as literary exaggeration rather than literal count. More careful estimates suggest the Persian army may have numbered somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000 men, still an extraordinary force for the ancient world. Xerxes built a bridge of boats across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe, and marched his army into Europe on that floating road. The Persian force sacked Athens. The Athenians evacuated their city before it fell. But then came Salamis. The naval battle at Salamis in 480 BCE is one of those moments where the weight of what was happening was felt even by the people living through it. Xerxes sat on a throne on a hillside overlooking the strait, watching what he expected to be the annihilation of the Greek fleet. What he watched instead was the systematic destruction of his own navy. The Greek triremes, smaller and more maneuverable, turned the narrow waters of the strait into a trap. The Persian fleet, too large and too crowded to maneuver effectively, was broken. Xerxes returned to Persia. The war continued for decades more, but the momentum had shifted permanently. Greece would not become a Persian province. Here is where the story becomes genuinely paradoxical. Persia did not collapse after the Greco-Persian Wars. The Achaemenid Empire continued for another century and a half, remaining one of the wealthiest and most powerful states on earth. But the wars had done something subtle and devastating. They had introduced Persia to a new kind of enemy, not one that could be bought or absorbed or tolerated into submission. One that believed it had a destiny. That destiny arrived in the form of a 22-year-old Macedonian king in 334 BCE. Alexander of Macedon, called the Great by later historians, though the Persians had rather different names for him, crossed the Hellespont with an army of roughly 40,000 soldiers. What followed was one of the most rapid conquests in the history of warfare. In less than a decade, Alexander destroyed the Achaemenid Empire entirely. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, fought on a flat plain in what is now northern Iraq. The Persian king Darius III had chosen the ground carefully, even ordering his men to level parts of the field to allow his scythed chariots to operate effectively. He commanded a force that ancient sources describe as numbering in the hundreds of thousands, though modern estimates are more cautious, perhaps 200,000 to 250,000, still vastly outnumbering Alexander's force. And yet Darius lost. The reasons historians debate, but the core pattern is clear. Alexander personally led a cavalry charge at the precise moment when a gap opened in the Persian line, driving directly toward Darius himself. The Persian king fled. His army, seeing their king abandon the field, disintegrated. Alexander went on to burn Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire, with its extraordinary palace complex that had taken generations to build. Whether this was a calculated political act, a drunken impulse, or deliberate revenge for the Persian burning of Athens a century and a half earlier, historians still debate. What is not debated is the result. One of the great architectural and cultural monuments of the ancient world was reduced to ash. The Achaemenid Empire ceased to exist. But here is the thing that most simplified histories miss. Persia did not cease to exist. The Iranian plateau, the Persian language, the cultural traditions, these survived. They absorbed Alexander's successors, the Seleucids, and then reasserted themselves through the Parthian Empire and later the Sassanid Empire. Iran proved to be not just a place, but an idea, one resilient enough to outlast its conquerors. That resilience would be tested again, more severely, in the 7th century CE. By 600 CE, the Sassanid Persian Empire was one of the two superpowers of the known world. The other was the Eastern Roman Empire, known to historians as Byzantium. These two empires had been fighting each other, on and off, for centuries. Their conflict was not simply territorial, it was civilizational. Sassanid Persia followed Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, centered on the cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood, light and darkness. Byzantium was Christian. Both empires believed, in their different ways, that they represented the correct ordering of the universe. Between 602 and 628 CE, they fought the most destructive war in their shared history. The Byzantine-Sassanid War of that period saw Persian armies advance further west than any Iranian force had gone since the Achaemenid era. Persian forces captured Jerusalem in 614 CE, taking the True Cross, Christianity's most sacred relic, back to Persia. They captured Egypt. They reached the walls of Constantinople itself. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius responded with one of the most remarkable military comebacks in history. Borrowing money from the church, reorganizing his army, and launching a series of deep strikes into Persian territory, He reversed the entire Persian advance within a decade. By 628 CE, the Sassanid Empire was exhausted, politically fractured, and financially broken. A rapid succession of rulers, some sources count over a dozen in just a few years, left the imperial government paralyzed. And then, from a direction that neither empire had seriously considered, came the Arab armies carrying the banner of a new religion. The Arab conquests of the 7th century are one of the most dramatic events in world history, and the conquest of Persia is perhaps the most consequential chapter within them. The Sassanid Empire, weakened by its war with Byzantium, met the Arab Muslim forces at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in 636 CE. The exact location and the exact casualty figures are subjects of historical debate. Arab sources tend toward dramatic numbers, and Sassanid records largely did not survive the conquest. What is clear is that the battle lasted several days, that the Sassanid commander Rostam Farrokhzad was killed, and that the Persian army broke. The Arab forces then advanced to the Sassanid capital at Ctesiphon on the banks of the Tigris River. The last Sassanid emperor, Yazdegerd III, fled eastward, pursued across his own empire, until he was killed near the city of Merv in Central Asia in 651 CE, reportedly murdered by a local miller for the money he was carrying. The empire he represented had already ceased to exist. The Islamic conquest of Persia did not simply change who governed the Iranian plateau. It changed the religion, the language of administration, the calendar, the legal system, and the cultural reference points of an entire civilization. Over the following centuries, the Iranian population converted to Islam, not all at once, not without resistance, but comprehensively. The Zoroastrian tradition survived, but as a minority faith. Persian literature, philosophy, and art were eventually reborn in a new Islamic context, producing a cultural renaissance that would give the world figures like Rumi, Ferdowsi, and Avicenna. But the immediate aftermath of the conquest was devastating. Cities were sacked, the Zoroastrian priestly class lost its social position, and the old aristocracy was largely displaced. Here is a detail that captures the scale of the cultural rupture. The Sassanid royal treasury at Ctesiphon was so vast that Arab accounts describe soldiers receiving shares of treasure that made them wealthy for life. The great palace of Ctesiphon, the Tak Khasra, with its enormous vaulted arch that still partially stands today, was looted and partially demolished. The arch itself, over 35 meters high, remains one of the largest single-span brick vaults ever constructed in the ancient world, and it survived only because it was too large and too solid to easily destroy. The conquest reshaped not just Persia but the entire Middle East. It is not an exaggeration to say that the world we live in today, its religious geography, its political boundaries, its cultural fault lines, was substantially shaped by what happened on those battlefields in the 7th century. But the story does not end there. 5 centuries later, a catastrophe arrived that made even the Arab conquest seem, in certain respects, survivable. In 1219 CE, the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan turned its attention westward toward the Khwarezmian Empire, which controlled much of Central Asia and the Iranian plateau. The trigger was a specific incident. The governor of the Khwarezmian city of Otrar executed a Mongol trade caravan and killed its merchants. Genghis Khan sent ambassadors demanding justice. The Khwarezmian Shah Muhammad II had the ambassadors killed. What followed was not a war. It was an extinction event for civilizations. The Mongol campaigns against the Khwarezmian Empire and the subsequent conquest of the Iranian plateau between 1219 and 1224 CE, and then again in the 1250s under Hulagu Khan, produced casualty figures that are almost impossible to process. Medieval Islamic sources describe the destruction of cities like Nishapur, Merv, Herat, and Balkh in terms that suggest near-total annihilation. The city of Merv, which had been one of the largest cities in the world, some estimates place its population at several hundred thousand, was reportedly depopulated so completely that when travelers passed through it years later, they found ruins and silence. Historians debate the exact numbers, as they must. Medieval sources routinely exaggerated for dramatic effect, and the Mongols themselves sometimes spread terrifying stories of their own destructiveness as a psychological weapon. But even accounting for exaggeration, the demographic evidence is stark. Archaeological surveys of Iranian population centers show a collapse in settlement patterns that took centuries to recover. Some modern historians estimate that the Iranian plateau lost between half and three-quarters of its population during the Mongol invasions through direct killing, famine, disease, and the destruction of the agricultural infrastructure, particularly the ancient Khanate irrigation systems that had sustained Iranian civilization for millennia. The Khanate systems deserve a moment of attention because they illustrate how the Mongol destruction operated at a civilizational level. The Khanates were underground channels that carried water from mountain aquifers to lowland agricultural areas, some of them stretching for dozens of kilometers. They required constant maintenance and represented centuries of accumulated engineering knowledge. When the Mongols killed the populations that maintained them and destroyed the social structures that organized their upkeep, the Khanates began to fail. Fields that had been productive for 1,000 years turned to desert. The land itself changed. The Mongol Ilkhanate, established by Hulagu Khan after his campaigns in the 1250s, which included the destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad in 1258, ending 5 centuries of Islamic imperial rule from that city, eventually settled into governing Iran. Within a few generations, the Mongol rulers converted to Islam and began patronizing Persian culture. The great historian Rashid al-Din wrote his world history under Mongol patronage. Persian poetry and miniature painting flourished. But the recovery was partial and uneven, and some regions never fully regained their pre-Mongol population levels. This is one of those moments where the question of legacy becomes genuinely uncomfortable. The Mongol destruction of Iran was catastrophic in human terms. But the Mongol Empire also, paradoxically, created the conditions for a period of cultural exchange across Eurasia, the Pax Mongolica, that facilitated the movement of ideas, technologies, and peoples across the continent. These two things are both true, and neither cancels the other out. The 15th century brought another wave of destruction, this time from a conqueror who explicitly modeled himself on Genghis Khan while adding his own particular character. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, a corruption of Timur Leng, meaning Timur the Lame, was a Central Asian ruler of Turco-Mongol origin who built an empire through campaigns of extraordinary destructive power. Between 1381 and 1405, his armies swept through Iran multiple times, sacking cities, massacring populations, and constructing the towers of skulls that became his trademark psychological weapon. Isfahan, one of the great cities of the Iranian world, was sacked by Timur in 1387. The city had initially surrendered, but a revolt against the Timurid garrison led to a reprisal that medieval sources describe as the killing of 70,000 people, with their skulls used to build towers as a warning to other cities. Historians treat these specific numbers with appropriate caution. They come from sources with their own agendas, but the broad pattern of Timurid destruction in Iran is well documented across multiple independent sources. What makes Timur's campaigns particularly complex is the contrast between his military destructiveness and his cultural patronage. His capital at Samarkand was one of the most beautiful cities in the medieval world, filled with architects and craftsmen, many of them forcibly relocated from the cities he had conquered. He destroyed Isfahan and then commissioned extraordinary buildings in Samarkand. He massacred scholars and then invited poets to his court. He was, in the assessment of many historians, one of the most paradoxical figures in the history of the region, simultaneously a destroyer and a builder, a patron of culture and its most effective executioner. The Timurid period also set the stage for one of the most consequential political and religious transformations in Iranian history. The rise of the Safavid dynasty in the early 16th century and the establishment of Twelver Shia Islam as the state religion of Iran. This was not simply a religious change. It was a political strategy that created a distinct Iranian identity separate from the surrounding Sunni Ottoman and Uzbek powers. And it made the wars that followed not just territorial conflicts, but sectarian ones. The Ottoman-Safavid Wars, fought across the 16th and 17th centuries, were among the most sustained military conflicts in the early modern Middle East. The first and most decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Calderan in 1514, fought in what is now northwestern Iran. The Ottoman Sultan Selim I, known as Selim the Grim, a nickname that tells you something about his reputation, led his army against the Safavid Shah Ismail I. Shah Ismail was a remarkable figure. He had founded the Safavid dynasty as a teenager, swept to power on the religious devotion of his followers, and had never lost a battle before Calderan. He was, by the accounts of both his supporters and his enemies, a charismatic and genuinely dangerous leader who believed himself to be a near-divine figure. His followers, known as the Kizilbash, meaning red heads for the distinctive red headgear they wore, were fanatically loyal. At Chaldiran, that fanaticism ran into Ottoman artillery and muskets. The Safavid cavalry, however brave and however motivated, could not overcome the technological advantage of the Ottoman gunpowder weapons. Ismail was defeated. He withdrew from the battlefield. According to some historical accounts, he never fully recovered psychologically from the loss. He had believed himself invincible, and Chaldiran shattered that belief. He reportedly spent his remaining years drinking heavily and largely withdrew from active governance. But here is the crucial point about Chaldiran. The Ottomans won the battle and could not win the war. They occupied the Safavid capital of Tabriz but could not hold it. The logistical challenges of maintaining an army deep in Iranian territory, combined with the continuing resistance of the Kizilbash, forced them to withdraw. The Safavid state survived, and its survival meant that the sectarian division between Shia Iran and Sunni Ottoman Turkey was institutionalized, a division that continues to shape Middle Eastern politics to this day. The Ottoman-Safavid wars continued intermittently for over a century. The Treaty of Zuhab in 1639 finally established a border between the two empires that is, remarkably, very close to the modern border between Iran and Iraq. A 17th-century diplomatic agreement still visible on contemporary maps. That is the kind of legacy that makes history feel less like the past and more like the present wearing different clothes. The wars of the 19th and early 20th centuries brought a different kind of devastation. The slow, grinding humiliation of a once great power being dismembered by European imperial ambitions. The Russo-Persian Wars of 1804 to 1813 and 1826 to 1828 resulted in the Qajar dynasty ceding enormous territories in the Caucasus to the Russian Empire, territories that are today the independent nations of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The treaties of Gulistan and Turkmenchay, signed in 1813 and 1828 respectively, were experienced by Iranians as catastrophic national humiliations. The Treaty of Turkmenchay in particular imposed conditions that went beyond territorial loss. It granted Russian citizens extraterritorial legal rights in Iran, meaning they could not be tried under Iranian law, and imposed heavy war indemnities. These provisions were seen by Iranian intellectuals and political figures as proof that their country had been reduced to a semi-colonial status. The anger generated by these treaties fed directly into the constitutional revolution of 1905 to 1911, one of the earliest democratic revolutions in Asia, in which Iranians demanded a constitution, a parliament, and limits on royal power. The connection between military defeat and political transformation is rarely more direct. The final war in our account is one that many viewers will have heard of, though perhaps not in its full historical context, the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988. This 8-year conflict was, by most measures, the deadliest war in the Middle East in the 20th century. Casualty estimates vary considerably, a reflection of both the chaos of the conflict and the political interests of the governments involved, but most historians and demographers estimate total deaths on both sides at somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million, with some estimates running higher. Millions more were wounded, displaced, or affected by chemical weapons attacks. The war began with the Iraqi invasion of Iran in September 1980. Shortly after the Iranian Revolution of 1979 had replaced the monarchy of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi with the Islamic Republic under Ayatollah Khomeini, the Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein calculated incorrectly, as it turned out, that the revolutionary government was weak, disorganized, and vulnerable. He expected a quick victory and the annexation of the oil-rich Khuzestan province. What he got instead was 8 years of grinding attrition warfare that bore disturbing resemblances to the First World War. Trench lines, human wave attacks, artillery barrages, and the use of chemical weapons by the Iraqi side against both Iranian military forces and Kurdish civilian populations. The Iranian government, drawing on revolutionary fervor and a population that had just overthrown a monarchy, mobilized enormous numbers of volunteers, including very young men and teenagers, for the front. The war ended in 1988 with a ceasefire that essentially restored the pre-war borders. Neither side achieved its objectives. The human cost was immense. The economic cost was staggering, and the political consequences rippled outward in ways that are still unfolding. The war strengthened the Islamic Republic's grip on power by creating a siege mentality. It deepened the Sunni-Shia sectarian divide in the region, and it left Iraq so financially exhausted that Saddam Hussein's subsequent decision to invade Kuwait in 1990, which triggered the Gulf War, was partly driven by his need to escape his war debts. One chain of causes and effects, stretching from 1980 to the present day. Step back now and look at the full arc of what we have covered. 2,500 years of wars on Iranian soil, each one reshaping not just the region but the world. The Greco-Persian Wars gave Athens the confidence to build a democracy and a cultural tradition that became the foundation of Western civilization. But they also planted the seeds of Alexander's conquest, which ended the First Great Persian Empire. The Arab conquest of the 7th century ended Zoroastrian Persia, but gave birth to a Persian Islamic civilization that produced some of the greatest intellectual and artistic achievements of the medieval world. The Mongol invasions caused demographic and environmental catastrophe on a scale that may have permanently altered the carrying capacity of parts of the Iranian plateau, but also, paradoxically, connected Iran to a wider Eurasian world. The Safavid-Ottoman Wars institutionalized the Sunni-Shia divide in a form that still structures Middle Eastern geopolitics, and the Iran-Iraq War of the 20th century demonstrated that the same plateau, the same crossroads, was still capable of generating conflicts that drew in the entire international community. What does it mean that one piece of land has been at the center of so many world-altering conflicts? Partly it is geography. The Iranian plateau is the bridge between the Mediterranean world and Central and South Asia, between the Arab world and the Turkic world, between the Indian Ocean trade routes and the Silk Road. Whoever controls it controls the connections between civilizations. That makes it perpetually valuable and perpetually contested. But partly it is something else. Iran is one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth. It has been conquered by Greeks, Arabs, Mongols, and Timurids, and each time it has eventually absorbed, transformed, or outlasted its conquerors. The Persian language survived Alexander. Persian culture survived the Arab conquest. Persian poetry survived the Mongols. There is something in the depth of that cultural tradition that has proven remarkably resilient. Not invulnerable, but resilient. The historian Arnold Toynbee wrote about civilizations in terms of challenge and response. The idea that great civilizations are defined not by the absence of catastrophe, but by their capacity to respond to it. By that measure, Iranian civilization has been tested more severely than almost any other, and its continued existence as a distinct cultural identity after 25 centuries of invasion and occupation is itself one of the more remarkable facts in human history. The wars we have described did not just kill people and redraw borders, they created the world. The borders of the modern Middle East, the distribution of religious communities across the region, the political fault lines between Shia and Sunni Islam, the relationship between Iran and its neighbors, all of these are direct inheritances from the conflicts we have examined. When you read a news headline about tensions between Iran and its neighbors, or about the role of Shia communities in the politics of Iraq, Lebanon, or Yemen, you are reading the latest chapter of a story that began in the 7th century CE, and in some respects even earlier. History is not the past. It is the present, still wearing the wounds of what came before. Now here is a question worth sitting with. Across all 7 of these conflicts, which single transformation do you think had the deepest and most lasting impact, not just on Iran, but on the world as a whole? Was it the Arab conquest that redirected an entire civilization's religious and cultural identity? Was it the Mongol invasions that may have permanently altered the demographic and environmental landscape of Central Asia and the Iranian plateau? Or was it something more recent, the Iran-Iraq War and its chain of consequences that we are still living through? Write your answer in the comments. There is no single correct response, and the debate among historians is genuinely unresolved. If this kind of deep cause and effect history is what you are looking for, history that takes the complexity seriously, that does not flatten the past into heroes and villains, that tries to show you how the world actually came to be the way it is, then subscribe to this channel. Every video we make is built on the same principle. The past deserves to be understood, not just remembered. In the next video, we are going to examine the rise and fall of the Safavid Empire in detail, how a dynasty born from a religious movement transformed Iran into one of the most sophisticated states in the early modern world, and why its collapse in the 18th century created a power vacuum that drew in every neighboring empire simultaneously. That story has everything: religious politics, military genius, artistic brilliance, and a collapse so sudden and so complete that contemporaries could barely believe it was happening. We will see you there.